The billionaire's son failed every test, and it took the maid's daughter, not a teacher, not his father, to show him the one truth that could finally save him. In the wealthiest corners of Connecticut, privilege is measured in private jets, estates the size of kingdoms, and futures written before a child can even walk. Caleb Montgomery had all of it, everything except purpose. At 17, the heir to a billion-dollar empire was failing every class, drifting further into apathy with each day. Teachers gave up, his father's patience wore thin, and Caleb himself seemed destined to collapse under the weight of his own indifference. But then, in the quiet of a vast library, he stumbled across someone the world would never notice. The maid's daughter, a girl with nothing, except one secret that could change everything. A secret Caleb was about to need more than he could imagine. He was drowning in a sea of gold, and no one could see him sink. His name was Caleb Montgomery, and the world belonged to him. But the one thing he couldn't buy was the one thing he needed most: a reason to care. The morning sun spilled across the manicured lawns of the Montgomery estate, a sprawling kingdom of clipped hedges and stone fountains nestled in the green hills of Connecticut. The light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the main dining room, glinting off the polished silverware and the crystal glasses that were never used but always ready. At the head of a mahogany table long enough to host a state dinner, 17-year-old Caleb Montgomery poked at his Eggs Benedict. They had been prepared by a chef who once worked for a 3-star Michelin restaurant in Paris. The hollandaise sauce was perfect. The English muffin was toasted to a precise, delicate crisp. Caleb felt nothing. He stared out the window, past the Olympic-sized swimming pool and the 10-car garage that housed his father's collection of vintage automobiles. His own car, a midnight blue sports car he'd received for his 16th birthday, was parked near the front. He hadn't even bothered to learn the model name. It was just a thing, another expensive object in a life full of them. Like the designer watch on his wrist or the private jet that flew him to Aspen for ski trips he didn't enjoy. They were all just part of the set dressing for a life that felt like someone else's. Across the vast expanse of polished wood, his father, Harrison Montgomery, sat with a tablet propped in front of him. Harrison was a man carved from ambition and success. His presence filled the room, cold and immense, like a marble statue. His eyes, a sharp, piercing gray, darted across stock market figures. He hadn't looked up once since sitting down. He didn't need to. He already knew everything he needed to know about his son. The school had called again yesterday. Another F, Caleb, Harrison said, his voice calm and sharp, cutting through the silence. He didn't raise it. He never did. His disapproval was a quiet, suffocating pressure. This time in history. How is that possible? Your family's history is written in the textbooks of this country, and you can't even pass a simple exam about it. Caleb shrugged, pushing his plate away. It was boring. Boring, Harrison repeated, the word dripping with disdain. He finally looked up, and his gaze was like being caught in a winter storm. Your great-great-grandfather built a railroad with his bare hands. Your grandfather weathered the Great Depression and built a steel empire from its ashes. I took a small loan and turned it into a global tech firm. Our story is the story of this nation's progress. And you find it boring. It's your story, Dad, not mine. Caleb mumbled, sinking lower in his chair. Then what is your story, Caleb? Harrison asked, leaning forward. The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. So far, it's a tale of academic failure and epic laziness. You have access to the best tutors in the world. 3 of them have quit this year alone. They all said the same thing. It's not that you can't learn. It's that you won't. Caleb clenched his jaw. He remembered the last tutor, a nervous man from Yale with a PhD in literature. Caleb had spent the entire session scrolling on his phone, smirking when the man tried to explain the symbolism in a poem. The man had packed his briefcase and left without a word. Why should Caleb try? What was the point? His future was already written for him. He would inherit the Montgomery fortune. He would take over the company. A high school GPA was a footnote in a story already finished. I don't need school, Caleb said, the arrogance in his voice a thin shield for the emptiness he felt. I'll just hire people who went to school. Harrison's face hardened. That is the most pathetic thing I have ever heard. You are a profound disappointment, Caleb. Not to the family name. To yourself. You just don't know it yet. He folded his tablet, stood up, and adjusted his tie. His suit was perfectly tailored, his posture unyielding. "I'm flying to Tokyo. I'll be back Thursday. Do try not to set the house on fire with your sheer lack of ambition." He walked out of the room without another glance. The silence he left behind was louder than any argument. Caleb sat there, alone at the giant table, the perfect food growing cold on his plate. He was a prince in a palace, but all he felt was the cold stone of his prison. Later that day, he slouched through the marble hallways of Northwood Preparatory Academy, a school so exclusive that tuition was a rounding error for most of the parents. The school crest was emblazoned on everything, a golden eagle clutching a book, a symbol of wisdom and power. To Caleb, it was a joke. His admission hadn't involved an interview or an entrance exam. It had involved the construction of a new science wing, funded by the Montgomery Foundation. He was known here for two things: his last name and his spectacular failures. He walked into his advanced physics class 10 minutes late. The teacher, Mr. Gable, stopped mid-sentence and sighed. "Nice of you to join us, Mr. Montgomery." Caleb smirked and slid into his seat in the back. He ignored the whispers and the stares. Some were envious. Others were scornful. He couldn't tell the difference anymore, and he didn't care. He pulled out his phone. The lesson was about theoretical astrophysics, the birth of stars. Mr. Gable spoke with passion about nebulae and fusion, about the cosmic dust that formed planets and people. Caleb looked at the screen of his phone, watching a video of a cat falling off a table. It felt more real. He failed the pop quiz at the end of the class. He didn't even try to answer the questions. He just drew a $sign on the paper and handed it in. Mr. Gable looked at it, his face a mixture of pity and frustration, and said nothing. What was there to say? The day ended with a meeting in the guidance counselor's office. Mrs. Albright was a kind woman with tired eyes who always smelled faintly of lavender. She had been trying to reach Caleb for 2 years. "Caleb," she began, folding her hands on her desk. His file was open in front of her. It was thick with reports of failed tests, skipped assignments, and disciplinary notes for his dismissive attitude. "We are at a critical point. Your GPA is now below the minimum requirement to even graduate. Statistically, you are in the bottom 1% of your class. Statistics are for people who have to try," he said, leaning back in his chair. Mrs. Albright's gentle smile faltered. "Your father is a great man. He's a pillar of this community. Don't you want to make him proud? My father respects stock prices and profit margins, not report cards." "And what do you respect, Caleb?" she asked, her voice soft. The question caught him off guard. He opened his mouth to give a clever, sarcastic answer, but nothing came out. He respected nothing. He believed in nothing. He was a hollow echo of a powerful name. The silence stretched on, and for the first time that day, a crack appeared in his armor. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine. She saw it in his eyes. "It's not too late," she said, her voice filled with a desperate hope. "We can find a way. We just need to find what motivates you." But Caleb didn't know what that was. He left her office and walked out of the school's main entrance, feeling the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on him. He got into his expensive car and drove, not home, but toward the coast. He parked by the ocean and watched the waves crash against the shore. Each wave rose with immense power, only to collapse into foam and disappear. It was the story of his life, full of potential, ending in nothing. Back at the estate that evening, the house was quiet and empty. His father was halfway across the world. The chefs and staff moved like ghosts, their presence felt but rarely seen. Caleb wandered into the grand library, a 2-story room with towering shelves of leather-bound books that no one ever read. He ran his hand along their spines. Shakespeare, Tolstoy, Faulkner. They were just decorations, like the suits of armor in the hallway or the priceless paintings on the walls. He heard a soft humming from the far corner of the room. Tucked away in a small alcove near the fireplace was a young girl. She couldn't have been more than 11 years old, with bright blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She was sitting on the floor, surrounded by a stack of books. Not the decorative ones from the shelves, but worn paperbacks from the local library. She was meticulously cleaning the baseboards, but her eyes were fixed on an open book propped against a chair leg. Caleb recognized her, vaguely. She was the maid's daughter, Susan's kid. Susan Thompson was a quiet, hard-working woman who had been cleaning the Montgomery mansion for the past year. She often brought her daughter with her after school, telling her to stay put in one room and do her homework quietly. The girl, whose name he didn't know, was always silent and invisible. Until now. He watched her for a moment, unseen. She was completely absorbed. Her brow was furrowed in concentration. He moved closer, curious to see what book could hold an 11-year-old's attention so fiercely. He expected a fantasy novel or a children's story. He craned his neck and read the title. Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. Caleb froze. He had been assigned to read that book in his philosophy class. He'd found it dense and impossible. He'd given up after 2 pages and paid another student to write a summary for him. And here was this little girl, the maid's daughter, reading it like it was the most natural thing in the world. She must have sensed him standing there, because she looked up. Her eyes were a startling, intelligent blue. There was no fear in them, no awe at his presence, just a calm, steady curiosity. "Hello," she said, her voice soft but clear. Caleb felt strangely flustered. "What are you reading?" he asked, even though he already knew. "A book," she replied simply. She held it up. "It's about how to be a good person, even when things are hard." She said it so plainly, without any pretense. He felt a sudden, sharp sting of shame. He, who had everything, complained that life was boring. She, who had so little, was reading a book about finding strength in hardship. "Isn't that a little advanced for you?" he asked, the words sounding condescending even to his own ears. She tilted her head. "The words are just words. The ideas are what matter. And ideas don't have an age limit." She looked him up and down, a thoughtful expression on her face. "My great-grandpa used to say that. He said most people wait until they're old to get wise, but by then, they're too tired to use it." Caleb didn't know what to say. He looked from her clear blue eyes to the ancient philosophy book and felt a chasm open up between his world and hers. He was the one who went to the elite prep school. He was the one with the private tutors. But in that moment, he felt like the most ignorant person in the room. "Who was your great-grandpa?" he asked. A small smile touched her lips. "He was a soldier. A sergeant. He fought in a war a long time ago. He said he learned more about life in a muddy trench than most people learn in a university." She carefully placed a bookmark in her book and closed it. "He said the most important secret in the world isn't a piece of information. It's a way of seeing." She stood up, picked up her cleaning cloth, and went back to wiping the baseboards. She was humming softly again, leaving Caleb standing there in the middle of the grand library, feeling more lost than ever. A way of seeing. What did that even mean? He was surrounded by priceless art, by stunning views of the ocean, by every beautiful thing money could buy. He saw everything. But as he looked at the little girl carefully doing her work, the ancient book resting beside her, he had the unsettling feeling that he was the one who was truly blind. The days that followed were a blur of the same suffocating routine. Caleb's brief, strange encounter with the maid's daughter, he learned her name was Clara May, faded into the back of his mind, a peculiar dream he couldn't quite shake. He tried to forget her steady blue eyes and the ridiculous idea of an 11-year-old reading Roman philosophy. He went back to his life of calculated indifference. But something had shifted. The armor of his arrogance felt thinner, the barbs of his sarcasm less sharp. He started to notice the cracks in his own perfect world. In his economics class, the teacher discussed market volatility. For a fleeting second, Caleb wanted to raise his hand and ask a real question, something his father might find interesting. But the words wouldn't form. He realized with a jolt that he didn't even know what to ask. He had spent so long tuning everything out that he had forgotten how to tune in. The moment passed, and he sank back into his chair, the familiar cloud of apathy settling over him once more. His friends, a pack of wealthy, bored teenagers who orbited him because of his name, cornered a younger student in the hallway. They knocked the boy's books from his hands, laughing as the papers scattered across the floor. Usually, Caleb would have joined in with a lazy smirk. Today, he watched from a distance and felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He saw the flush of shame on the younger boy's face, the desperate way he gathered his things, trying to become invisible. For the first time, Caleb didn't see a joke. He saw cruelty. He turned and walked away, the sound of his friends' laughter feeling hollow and ugly. He started noticing Clara May more. Not because he was looking for her, but because his world had become so quiet and empty that small details began to stand out. He saw her one afternoon from the library window, sitting in the sprawling gardens with the estate's head gardener, a weathered old man named Mr. Henderson. She wasn't just sitting. She was pointing to various plants, and Mr. Henderson was nodding, a look of genuine surprise and respect on his face. Caleb saw her touch the leaf of a rose bush with a gentle, knowing finger, as if she understood its secrets. Another evening, he found a half-finished game of chess set up on a small table in the sunroom. He knew his father sometimes played against a computer program. Caleb had tried to learn once, but found it tedious. He studied the board. The black pieces were in a seemingly impossible position, cornered and on the verge of defeat. He saw no way out. The next morning, when he passed by the table, he saw that a single black pawn had been moved. The move was so simple, so unexpected, that it completely changed the dynamic of the game. It opened up a brilliant, unforeseen line of attack. He knew, with a certainty that unsettled him, that it had been her. Harrison Montgomery returned from Tokyo on Thursday evening, sweeping into the house like a storm front. He was in a foul mood. The deal had been complicated. He found Caleb in the media room, staring blankly at a movie he wasn't watching. Harrison didn't say hello. He simply dropped a thick manila envelope on the coffee table in front of his son. "From Northwood," Harrison said, his voice dangerously low. "A comprehensive report on your academic standing, your attendance, and your attitude. It seems you've managed to set a new record for underachievement." Caleb didn't look at the envelope. "I told you I don't care about school." "That much is obvious," Harrison snapped. "But you will care about this." He pulled a sleek black phone from his pocket, Caleb's phone, and placed it on the table. Next to it, he dropped Caleb's wallet, thick with credit cards. Finally, he tossed a set of car keys onto the pile. They landed with a metallic clatter that echoed in the silent room. "What's this?" Caleb asked, a sense of dread creeping over him. "This is the end of the line, Caleb. The free ride is over. No more phone, no more unlimited funds, and no more car. They are privileges, and you have proven with spectacular certainty that you have earned none of them." Caleb stared at the pile of his confiscated life. A tremor of panic shot through him. "You can't do that. How am I supposed to get to school? The same way thousands of other students do. The school bus stops at the end of our road at 6:45 a.m. I suggest you don't be late." The bus. Caleb choked out the word. It was unthinkable. A Montgomery taking the school bus? It was social suicide. "Everyone will see me." "Good," Harrison said, his eyes like chips of ice. "Let them see you. Let them see that the name Montgomery is not a shield for failure. Perhaps a dose of public humiliation is the only lesson that will finally get through your thick skull. You want to act like you have nothing? Fine. Now you do." Harrison turned and left, the finality of his decision hanging in the air. Caleb was left staring at the keys to his car, the gateway to his freedom, now utterly useless. He felt like he couldn't breathe. His father hadn't just taken his things. He had taken his identity. Without the car, the money, the status, who was he? He was nobody, just a failing student who had to ride the bus. The next morning was a nightmare. He woke up before dawn, the house dark and silent. He dressed in the plainest clothes he owned and walked the half-mile down the winding private driveway to the main road. The air was cold, and the sky was a grim, unforgiving gray. He stood by the side of the road, hands shoved in his pockets, feeling exposed and ashamed. When the big yellow bus lumbered to a stop, its doors hissing open, he felt 100 pairs of eyes on him. He climbed the steps, avoiding eye contact, and slid into an empty seat at the back. The worn vinyl cracked and cold. The bus smelled of diesel fumes and stale bubblegum. It was the longest 20 minutes of his life. This became his new reality. His friends at school mocked him relentlessly. Kyle Jennings, a boy whose father was a rival of Harrison's, was particularly vicious. "Look, everyone," Kyle shouted across the cafeteria. "Montgomery's finally slumming it with the rest of us. How's the bus ride, Caleb? Did you get your designer suit dirty?" Caleb would just clench his fists and walk away, the angry retort dying on his tongue. What could he say? It was true. He was a joke. Stripped of his phone and his car, his evenings became long, empty stretches of time. He couldn't escape into a screen or drive away from his problems. He was trapped in the huge, silent house with nothing but his own thoughts for company. And it was in this forced silence that he began to truly see Clara May. He found her one afternoon in the kitchen, helping her mother polish the silver. Susan Thompson was a woman of few words, with a tired but kind face. She moved with a quiet efficiency, but Caleb could see the worry etched around her eyes. Her job, her life, was precarious. He watched as Clara May took a tarnished fork and worked on it with a soft cloth. She wasn't just cleaning it. She was studying it. "Why do some spots get darker than others?" she asked her mother softly. "It's just tarnish, honey." From the air, Susan replied, her focus on her own work. "But it's not the same everywhere," Clara May insisted, holding it up to the light. "It's darkest in the little carved parts, because the air gets trapped there longer. It's like a grudge. If you don't clean out the small, hidden places, that's where the bitterness settles." Caleb stood in the doorway, stunned by the simple, profound observation. He had looked at silverware 1,000 times and seen only forks and spoons. She looked at it and saw a lesson about human nature. His desperation finally outweighed his pride. He needed help, and the tutors, the counselors, and his own father had all failed him. This strange, quiet girl with the old soul was his last resort. He found her later that week, back in the library, not reading, but sketching in a small notebook. He walked over, his heart pounding nervously. "Hi," he said. She looked up, her expression calm and unreadable. "Hello, Caleb." He swallowed hard. "That thing you said about your great-grandpa. About a way of seeing. What did you mean?" She closed her sketchbook and looked at him, her blue eyes seeming to peer right through his defenses. "Why do you want to know?" "Because," he struggled for the words. "Because I think I'm blind. I look at everything, and I don't see anything. I listen, and I don't hear. I'm failing everything. Not just school. Everything." The confession came out in a raw, broken whisper. It was the most honest thing he had said in years. Clara May was silent for a long moment, studying his face. Her mother, Susan, who had been dusting nearby, paused and looked over, a worried expression on her face. She started to move toward them, to shoo her daughter away from the troubled rich boy. But Clara May held up a hand, a small, subtle gesture that stopped her mother in her tracks. She turned her full attention back to Caleb. "My great-grandpa, Sergeant Elias Peterson, he was a scout in the war," she said, her voice low and serious. "His job was to go into enemy territory, alone, and see things that no one else could see. Not just to look at a forest, but to see which branches were broken, to see which rocks had been moved, to see the story of what happened there. His life, and the lives of all the men in his company, depended on it." She leaned forward slightly. "He taught me that most people live their whole lives on the surface. They see the car, but not the engine. They hear the words, but not the meaning behind them. This way of seeing, it's not a trick. It's about paying attention. It's about understanding the why behind the what." Can you teach me?" Caleb asked, the question feeling heavy and momentous. "I'll do whatever you say." Her mother looked on, her worry now mixed with a flicker of awe at her daughter's quiet authority. Clara May held his gaze. "I can show you what he showed me. But it's not easy. It will be harder than any test you've ever failed at school. There are conditions." "Anything," he said, desperate. "First," she said, holding up one finger, "you have to start from zero. Everything you think you know, about your school, about your father, about yourself, forget it. It's just noise." She held up a second finger. "Second, you must do exactly as I say, even if it seems strange or pointless. There is a reason for everything." Finally, she looked him dead in the eye, her expression more serious than he had ever seen on anyone, let alone a child. "And third, you have to put your pride in the trash can. It's the heaviest thing you carry, and it's useless. It's the wall you've built between yourself and the world. If you can't get rid of it, you'll never see a thing." Caleb stared at her, this 11-year-old girl who spoke with the wisdom of a general. He felt a flicker of hope, the first he had felt in a long, long time. It was a terrifying, exhilarating feeling. He took a deep breath. "Okay," he whispered. "I'll do it." She nodded once, a crisp, decisive gesture. "Good," she said. "Your first lesson begins tomorrow. At sunrise. In the garden. Don't be late." The sun was just a faint blush on the eastern horizon when Caleb arrived in the garden the next morning. A cool, damp mist clung to the ground, and the air was still and silent. For the first time in his life, Caleb was awake before the world, and it felt like a foreign country. He saw Clara May standing near the enormous, ancient oak tree that dominated the center of the estate's main lawn. She was wearing simple overalls and holding a small, empty glass jar. She didn't greet him. She just pointed to the ground at the base of the tree. "What do you see?" she asked. Caleb looked down. He saw grass, damp with dew. He saw a few scattered leaves and a patch of dark, rich soil where the roots of the great oak broke through the surface. He felt a surge of irritation. He had dragged himself out of bed at this ridiculous hour for this. "I see grass. And dirt," he said, his voice flat. "Look again," she said, her tone patient but firm. "Don't just look. See." He sighed and crouched down, forcing himself to stare at the patch of ground. It was just ground. He felt foolish. This was a stupid game. He was about to stand up and tell her this was a waste of time when a tiny movement caught his eye. An ant, struggling to carry a breadcrumb that was 3 times its size. He watched it navigate a perilous landscape of pebbles and blades of grass. Then he noticed something else. A small, perfect spiderweb strung between 2 blades of grass, glistening with dew. A work of art that would be gone as soon as the sun rose higher. He saw a tiny, purple wildflower, no bigger than his thumbnail, pushing its way up through a crack in the soil. He had walked past this tree 1,000 times and never noticed any of it. He stayed there for a long time, just looking. He started to see patterns in the way the moss grew on the oak's roots. He saw the intricate network of veins on a fallen leaf. He saw the way the dewdrops acted like tiny magnifying glasses, revealing the texture of the grass beneath them. The patch of ground was not just grass and dirt. It was a world, teeming with struggle, life, and beauty. He finally looked up. Clara May was watching him, a small, knowing smile on her face. "The world is full of secrets," she said softly. "You just have to be quiet enough to hear them, and still enough to see them." This was the beginning of his training. Her lessons were never about books or facts. They were about perception. One day, she took him to the vast kitchen. The head chef, a temperamental Frenchman named Jean-Pierre, was in a frenzy, directing his staff as they prepared for a dinner party Harrison was hosting that evening. The air was a cacophony of clanging pots, sizzling pans, and shouted orders. "Close your eyes," Clara May commanded. Caleb obeyed, feeling out of place and conspicuous. "Okay, now what?" "Just listen," she said. "But don't listen to the noise. Listen to the story. What is the kitchen telling you?" At first, all he heard was chaos. But he forced himself to focus, to separate the sounds. He heard the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of a chef chopping vegetables, the sound steady and practiced. He heard the nervous, high-pitched clatter of a younger kitchen hand dropping a spoon. He heard the confident sizzle of a steak hitting a hot pan and the anxious hiss of a sauce boiling over. He heard Jean-Pierre's voice, sharp and stressed, barking an order, followed by the quiet, respectful "yes, chef" from his team. It wasn't just noise. It was a symphony of pressure, skill, anxiety, and expertise. It was a story about a team working under immense stress to create something perfect. He could almost taste the tension in the air. "They're scared of him," Caleb said, his eyes still closed. "The head chef. They respect him, but they're afraid of making a mistake." "Good," Clara May whispered. "Now what else?" Caleb focused again, listening deeper. "Someone is new," he said, surprising himself. "Their movements are clumsy. They dropped something." He opened his eyes. Clara May was nodding. She pointed to a young man in the corner, frantically trying to clean up a small spill, his face flushed with embarrassment. Caleb had never felt more connected to the world around him. He had spent his life in this house, but he had never truly been in it. His most difficult lesson came a week later. Clara May led him to his father's study. It was a room Caleb avoided, a shrine to Harrison Montgomery's success. The walls were lined with awards, photos of him with world leaders, and framed copies of magazine covers bearing his face. It was a room that always made Caleb feel small and inadequate. "Your father called the school yesterday," Clara May said, her voice gentle. "He spoke with your guidance counselor. He wants another report on your progress." Caleb's stomach tightened. "There is no progress. My grades are still terrible. I haven't turned in an assignment in a month." "He's going to be furious." "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe you're only reading the cover of the book. Look around this room, Caleb. Really look. What do you see?" He saw what he always saw, a monument to a man he could never please. "I see proof that I'm a failure," he muttered. "That's your pride talking," she corrected him calmly. "Your pride is a mirror. It only shows you a reflection of yourself. I want you to look through the window. Look at him." She guided him to a large, framed photograph on the wall. It was a picture of a much younger Harrison Montgomery, standing in front of a dilapidated garage. He was holding a jumble of wires and a circuit board. He looked thin, hungry, and exhausted, but his eyes were blazing with an intensity Caleb had never seen before. There was no tailored suit, no powerful CEO. It was just a young man with a dream. This was his first office, Clara May said softly. My mom said he used to work 18 hours a day. He slept on the floor. He put every dollar he had into this. She then pointed to a smaller, older photo tucked away on a bookshelf. It showed a stern-faced man in overalls standing next to a young boy. The boy was Harrison. He was holding a report card and looking up at his father with a mixture of fear and hope. That was your grandfather, Clara May explained. He was a hard man. He believed that success was the only thing that mattered. He taught your father that love and approval had to be earned. They weren't given for free. Caleb stared at the photos, his heart pounding. He had seen them before, of course, but he had never seen them. He had seen them as chapters in the great Montgomery myth. Now, he saw them as pieces of a person who was once young and scared, a person who was taught that his value was tied to his achievements. He looked around the room again. He saw the awards, not as weapons used to measure his own failures, but as scars from his father's battles. He saw the photos with presidents and kings, not as trophies, but as evidence of a relentless, lonely climb to the top. He wasn't looking at a god in a temple anymore. He was looking at the story of a man, a brilliant, driven, and deeply flawed man who was terrified of failure, because failure meant he was unworthy of love. He doesn't push you because he's disappointed in you, Clara May whispered, as if reading his mind. He pushes you because he's terrified for you. He doesn't know any other way to show you that he cares. The realization hit Caleb with the force of a physical blow. All the anger and resentment he had held for his father began to dissolve, replaced by a painful, aching empathy. His father wasn't a tyrant. He was a prisoner, locked in a cage built by his own father. And he had passed that cage down to Caleb. That evening, Harrison Montgomery came home late, looking tired and stressed. He walked past Caleb in the hallway with barely a nod. The old Caleb would have bristled at the dismissal. The new Caleb saw the deep weariness in his father's eyes and the slight slump in his shoulders. He took a deep breath, his heart hammering in his chest. Dad, Harrison stopped and turned, his expression impatient. What is it, Caleb? I have a dozen calls to make. I saw that old photo of you. In the garage, Caleb said, his voice unsteady. It must have been hard, starting with nothing like that. Harrison was taken aback. He stared at his son, suspicion in his eyes. He was waiting for the sarcastic punchline, the request for money. But it never came. He just saw genuine curiosity on his son's face. A strange, unreadable expression crossed Harrison's face. The hard lines around his mouth softened for just a fraction of a second. It was, he said, his voice gruff but without its usual edge. It was a different time. He paused, as if he wanted to say more, but the habit of a lifetime was too strong. He simply nodded curtly and continued down the hall to his study. It wasn't a breakthrough. It wasn't a heart-to-heart conversation, but it was a start. It was a single, clean note in a lifetime of noise. For the first time, Caleb hadn't been talking to the CEO or the family patriarch. He had been talking to his father. And for the first time, his father had heard him. Caleb stood in the hallway, a sense of quiet wonder washing over him. He hadn't passed a test or earned a grade, but he had seen something. He had connected, and it felt more real and more valuable than anything he had ever owned. He knew he still had a long way to go. His grades were a disaster, and his future was a terrifying blank slate. But for the first time, he felt like he was standing on solid ground. The world was beginning to come into focus, one small, forgotten detail at a time. All thanks to the maid's daughter, who had shown him the secret was not in finding the right answers, but in learning to ask the right questions. Caleb's transformation was not a sudden, dramatic explosion. It was a slow, quiet dawn. The lessons in the garden and the kitchen began to bleed into the rest of his life, coloring everything with a new layer of meaning. He started taking the school bus not with a sense of shame, but with a feeling of quiet observation. He noticed the tired mother of 3 in the front seat, her brow furrowed with worry as she looked over a handful of crumpled bills. He saw the 2 teenage boys in the back, who always acted tough, but whose laughter never quite reached their eyes. He started to see the people around him not as extras in his own movie, but as the main characters of their own complex stories. This new lens began to refocus his view of school. He walked into his history class, the one his father had so scathingly condemned him for failing, and for the first time, he listened. Mr. Gable was lecturing about the Industrial Revolution. Before, Caleb would have heard a dry recitation of dates, inventions, and long-dead industrialists. Now he heard a story of desperation and ingenuity, a story of families leaving their farms for the promise of a better life, only to find themselves trapped in the gears of a new, relentless machine. Mr. Gable put a photograph on the projector. It showed a group of grim-faced factory workers, their faces smudged with soot, their bodies slumped with exhaustion. As you can see, Mr. Gable said, the conditions were harsh. Long hours, low pay. It was a difficult time for the working class. From the back of the room, Kyle Jennings snorted. They look miserable. They should have just gotten a better job. A few of his friends snickered. The old Caleb would have remained silent, or perhaps even joined in the mockery. The new Caleb felt a surge of something else. Not anger, but a need to correct the narrative. He raised his hand. Mr. Gable looked up, his surprise so evident it was almost comical. Yes, Mr. Montgomery. They couldn't just get a better job, Caleb said, his voice clear and steady. The entire class turned to look at him. There were no better jobs. Look at their hands. They're rough, calloused. These people worked with their hands their whole lives. The man in the middle, his shoulders are slumped. It's not just from a long day. It's the weight of knowing that this is it. This is his entire life. And look at the boy on the left. He can't be more than 12. He's not looking at the camera. He's looking at the man next to him. Maybe it's his father. He's not just seeing a tired worker. He's seeing his own future. A stunned silence fell over the room. Kyle Jennings stared at him, his mouth agape. Mr. Gable slowly lowered the laser pointer he was holding. He was looking at Caleb not as a failure, but as a student. That is an exceptionally insightful analysis, Caleb, Mr. Gable said, his voice filled with a genuine, astonished respect. Thank you. Caleb felt a warmth spread through his chest. It was a feeling more satisfying than any new car or expensive watch. It was the feeling of being seen, of being understood. He started applying Clara May's methods to everything. In literature, he stopped trying to memorize symbolism and started trying to understand the author's pain, their joy, their reason for telling the story. In physics, he stopped seeing formulas on a page and started seeing the elegant, invisible laws that governed the universe, from the orbit of a planet to the arc of a thrown baseball. His grades began to change. Not overnight, but slowly, steadily. An F became a D. A D became a C-. It wasn't a miracle. It was hard work. For the first time in his life, Caleb was trying. He stayed late in the library. He asked questions in class. He stopped being a spectator in his own education and started being a participant. His father noticed, of course. Harrison Montgomery noticed everything. He saw the improved report from the school, but he was suspicious. He saw it not as progress, but as a trick, another one of Caleb's schemes. What is this, Caleb? Harrison asked one evening, holding the interim report. Did you finally decide to pay someone to take your tests for you? Because these grades, while still abysmal, are slightly less abysmal than usual. I'm just trying, Caleb said, refusing to let his father's cynicism extinguish his newfound spark. Trying isn't good enough, Harrison shot back. Results are the only thing that matters. You have final exams in 3 weeks. They will determine whether you graduate. They will determine whether this little experiment in slumming it on the school bus comes to an end. Do not disappoint me again. The pressure was immense. The final exams were a mountain he had to climb, and he knew he couldn't do it alone. He went to Clara May. He found her in the greenhouse, carefully tending to a collection of orchids. He doesn't believe me, Caleb said, the frustration evident in his voice. I'm finally doing the work, and he thinks it's a scam. Clara May didn't look up from her task. She gently misted the leaves of a delicate white orchid. It doesn't matter what he believes, she said. It matters what you do. His opinion is just weather. It changes. Your actions are the ground you stand on. Make it solid. But how? 3 weeks isn't enough time to learn a whole year's worth of material. You don't need to learn it, she said, finally turning to look at him. You already know it. The information is in the books. It's in your notes. What you need to learn is how to connect it. History, science, literature, they're not separate islands. They're all part of the same continent. You just need to find the bridges. Her idea of studying was unlike anything he had ever done. They didn't use flashcards or practice tests. Instead, she had him create a map. A giant, sprawling mind map on a whiteboard in the unused ballroom of the mansion. They started with a single event, the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. His great-great-grandfather's legacy. Your history book says it was built between 1863 and 1869, she said. That's a fact. It's boring. It's dead. Let's make it alive. Why was it built then? Caleb thought for a moment. The Civil War was happening. The government wanted to connect the country, to make sure the West stayed with the Union. Good, she nodded. That's the political bridge. Now what about the science? How did they build it? Steel. Caleb answered, the pieces starting to click together. The Bessemer process was a new invention. It made steel cheap and strong. They needed it for the rails. And dynamite, for blasting through the mountains. The scientific bridge, she said, drawing lines on the whiteboard connecting politics to chemistry and engineering. Now what about the people? Who built it? Immigrants, Caleb said, remembering the photos from class. Mostly Chinese and Irish. They were treated terribly. Paid almost nothing. Thousands died. The social bridge, Clara said, her voice soft. And what stories came from that? What poems and songs were written about the loneliness of the prairie, the danger of the work, the hope of a new life? The literary bridge, Caleb finished, a sense of awe dawning on him. For 3 weeks, they filled the whiteboard. Every event, every formula, every character in a novel was a dot on the map. And they connected them. The rise of the stock market was connected to the psychology of fear and greed. The structure of a Shakespearean sonnet was connected to the mathematical beauty of the golden ratio. Everything was part of a larger, interconnected story. He wasn't just memorizing facts anymore. He was understanding the world. During one of their late-night sessions, fueled by tea and sandwiches her mother quietly left for them, Caleb's curiosity about Clara May's own story became too strong to ignore. Your great-grandpa, he began carefully, Sergeant Peterson. How do you know so much about what he thought? Clara May grew quiet. She walked over to her small backpack and pulled out a worn, leather-bound journal. The corners were frayed, and the pages were yellowed with age. She opened it and handed it to Caleb. The handwriting inside was small and precise, the ink faded but still legible. It was filled with sketches of plants, maps of terrain, and detailed observations. But it wasn't a soldier's logbook. It was a philosopher's journal. One entry read, "Saw a spider's web this morning. The wind tore a hole in it." The spider did not complain. It did not mourn. It simply began to rebuild. Nature does not understand pride. It only understands purpose. Another entry read, "The captain tells us to hate the enemy, to see him as a monster. But when I look through my binoculars, I see a boy no older than my own son, cleaning his rifle. He is probably just as scared as I am. The most dangerous weapon in any war is not a gun. It is the story we tell ourselves about the other side." Caleb looked up from the journal, his throat tight with emotion. He wrote this? In the middle of a war. Clara May nodded. He believed that the only way to survive the ugliness of the world was to search for its hidden beauty. The only way to fight hatred was to search for understanding. He didn't fight for a flag or a country. He fought for the idea that even in the darkest of places, there was a better way to see. She revealed then that her great-grandfather had been awarded the Medal of Honor, not for a single act of bravery, but for his uncanny ability to anticipate the enemy's moves, to see patterns no one else did, saving his company from ambush on 3 separate occasions. He wasn't a hero because he was a great soldier. He was a hero because he was a great thinker. After the war, he had refused all accolades and lived a quiet life, pouring all his wisdom and his unique way of seeing the world into his great-granddaughter. He said the world was broken, Clara May said, her voice barely a whisper. And the only way to fix it was to raise a generation of people who knew how to see. Not just to look at the broken pieces, but to see how they could fit back together again. Caleb finally understood. Clara May wasn't just a bright little girl. She was a legacy. She was the keeper of a sacred trust, a secret passed down from a war-torn trench. A secret she was now sharing with him. The day of his first final exam arrived. It was history. He walked into the classroom and sat down, his heart calm. He wasn't scared. He looked at the exam paper at the essay question that would have terrified him a month ago. Discuss the primary economic, social, and political factors that led to the Great Depression. He picked up his pen. He didn't just write about the stock market crash of 1929. He wrote about the fragile psychology of a nation built on credit. He wrote about the Dust Bowl, connecting meteorological events to the mass migration of desperate families. He wrote about the songs of Woody Guthrie, the photographs of Dorothea Lange, the literature of John Steinbeck. He didn't just answer the question. He told the story. He was the last one to finish. He handed his paper to Mr. Gable, who looked at him with a curious, hopeful expression. Caleb walked out of the room, not knowing if he had passed or failed. But for the first time, it didn't matter. He hadn't done it for his father. He hadn't done it for the great. He had done it for himself. He had taken the broken pieces of the past, and he had made them whole. And he knew, with a quiet certainty, that nothing in his life would ever be the same. The 2 weeks of exams passed in a focused haze. For Caleb, it was a marathon of applying Clara May's lessons, of finding the hidden bridges between disparate subjects. He walked out of his final exam, physics, feeling not drained, but electrified. He had no idea what his final grades would be, but he felt a profound sense of accomplishment that was entirely new to him. He hadn't just taken tests. He had engaged in a deep conversation with the accumulated knowledge of generations. He found Clara May in the library, shelving books. He didn't have to say a word. She looked at him, and a slow, brilliant smile spread across her face. "You did it," she said. "It wasn't a question." "I don't know," Caleb admitted. "But I feel different. Like I just woke up." "That was the only test that mattered," she replied, placing a copy of the Odyssey back in its place. The official results were sent to his father first. A week later, Harrison Montgomery summoned Caleb to his study. The room felt different now, less like a courtroom and more like a complicated man's private sanctuary. Harrison was sitting behind his enormous desk, a single sheet of paper in his hand. His face was a mask of stone, completely unreadable. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. This was the moment of truth. "I spoke with the headmaster at Northwood this morning," Harrison began, his voice devoid of emotion. He slid the paper across the polished desk. "This is your final report card." Caleb picked it up with a trembling hand. He scanned the grades. History, B+. English literature, B. Economics, C+. Physics, B. He had passed. He had passed every single class. He wasn't at the top of the class, not by a long shot, but he had done more than just pass. He had climbed from the absolute bottom to the respectable middle in just a few short weeks. He had done the impossible. He looked up at his father, a feeling of triumph welling in his chest, expecting what? Praise? A smile? A handshake? He got none of it. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his eyes cold and narrow. "It's a remarkable improvement," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "So remarkable, in fact, that it's impossible. No student goes from a 0.8 GPA to a 2.8 in a single semester. No one." The air went cold. "What are you saying?" Caleb asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm saying you cheated," Harrison said, the words landing like stones. "I don't know how. I don't know who you paid or what strings you pulled. But this is not the work of an honest student. This is the work of a con artist. And while I can tolerate a fool, I will not tolerate a cheat in my house." Caleb stared at him, his mind reeling. It was the ultimate irony. For the first time in his life, he had done something honestly, with his own effort, and his father was accusing him of fraud. The injustice of it was so profound, it stole his breath. All the old anger, the old resentment, came roaring back. "You're wrong," Caleb said, his voice shaking with a mixture of fury and pain. "You're wrong. I did the work. I learned it. Don't lie to me," Harrison thundered, slamming his fist on the desk. "You've been a disappointment your entire life. But this is a new low. To lie so brazenly to my face. Did you think I was that stupid?" In that moment, something inside Caleb snapped. The fear he had always felt in his father's presence was burned away by the white-hot fire of his anger. But Clara May's lessons held. He didn't just see a tyrant. He saw the man in the photograph, the boy desperate for his own father's approval. He saw a man so blinded by his own rigid definition of success that he couldn't recognize real growth when it was right in front of him. "No," Caleb said, his voice suddenly calm and clear. The rage settled into a core of absolute certainty. I don't think you're stupid, Dad. I think you're blind. You've spent your whole life looking at balance sheets and stock tickers, and you've forgotten how to read a person. You look at me, and you don't see a son. You see a bad investment. You've been so obsessed with teaching me the cost of everything that you never taught me the value of anything. He placed the report card back on the desk. I didn't do this for you, he said, the words ringing with a newfound authority. I did this for me. And frankly, whether you believe me or not is your problem, not mine. I don't need your approval anymore. I'm not a line item on your ledger. He turned and walked out of the study, leaving Harrison Montgomery speechless for the first time in his life. He left his father sitting alone in his temple of success, a king on a throne of gold, suddenly and utterly powerless. Caleb found Clara May sitting on the steps of the back porch, watching the sunset. Her mother, Susan, was nearby, packing her bag to go home for the evening. He didn't believe me, Caleb said, sitting down beside her. The anger had faded, leaving behind a hollow ache. I know, she said softly. Susan Thompson looked at Caleb, her eyes full of a sympathy that was almost unbearable. I'm sorry, Caleb. He's a hard man to please. It doesn't matter, Caleb said, trying to convince himself as much as them. I'm done trying. He looked at Clara May, at this incredible 11-year-old girl who had single-handedly changed the entire course of his life. How can I ever repay you? Clara May looked not at him, but at her mother. A silent, meaningful glance passed between them. It was Susan who finally spoke, her voice hesitant but firm. There is one thing. A favor. Anything, Caleb said instantly. It's about my brother, Susan said, her gaze dropping to her hands. Clara May's uncle. He worked for your father's company for 20 years. A senior programmer. He was loyal, hardworking. A few years ago, there was a security breach. A big one. Millions of dollars were lost. They needed someone to blame, and they blamed him. They said he sold company secrets. Your father fired him. Clara May picked up the story, her voice tight. He was disgraced. No one else would hire him. We lost everything. That's why my mom has to work 2 jobs. That's why we had to sell our house. Caleb was stunned. But if he was innocent. He was, Susan said, a fierce conviction in her voice. My brother would never do something like that. He loved that company. He helped build it. But your father, he needed a quick answer. A scapegoat. He didn't look at the evidence. He just looked at the bottom line. And then Caleb understood. He finally saw the whole picture. The final, heartbreaking connection on the map. This was never just about his grades. From the very beginning, it was about justice. It was a daughter's quiet, brilliant, desperate plan to get close enough to the heart of the Montgomery Empire to save her family's honor. The secret, Caleb whispered, the pieces falling into place. The way of seeing. Your great-grandfather taught it to you. And you taught it to me. So that I could. So that you could see the truth, Clara May finished for him. So you could show your father what he refuses to see. The real story isn't always the easiest one to read. The weight of it all settled on Caleb. The moral challenge he had only read about in books was now his own. His loyalty to his father versus his debt to the girl who had saved him. But it wasn't even a choice. He knew what he had to do. He spent the next 2 days locked in the library, not with textbooks, but with old company reports, archived network logs, and financial statements he accessed using his father's login, which he had memorized years ago. He applied Clara May's methods. He didn't look for a single piece of evidence. He looked for the story. He looked for the gaps, the inconsistencies, the moments where the official narrative didn't quite line up. He found it. A digital breadcrumb trail, buried under years of data. A series of encrypted transfers, cleverly disguised, that didn't lead to Susan's brother, but to a senior executive on the board. A man who was a fierce rival of his father's. A man named Kyle Jennings Sr., the father of the boy who had mocked him for riding the bus. It was a digital coup, a brilliant act of corporate sabotage, and Clara May's uncle had been the perfect fall guy. Caleb printed everything. He organized it into a clear, undeniable timeline. He took the folder and walked back into his father's study. Harrison was staring out the window, looking old and tired. Caleb didn't say a word. He just placed the folder on the desk. Harrison looked at it, then at Caleb, his eyes full of suspicion. He opened it. He began to read. Caleb watched as his father's face went through a storm of emotions. Confusion, then irritation, then dawning comprehension, and finally, a deep, soul-shaking shock. The mask of the powerful CEO fell away, revealing the face of a man who had made a terrible, terrible mistake. He had ruined an innocent man's life, not out of malice, but out of pride and expediency, out of a willful blindness. He looked up at Caleb. The arrogance was gone. The anger was gone. All that was left was a raw, painful vulnerability. You found this, Harrison stammered. How? I learned how to see, Caleb said simply. A long silence filled the room. Then, for the first time Caleb could remember, he saw tears well up in his father's eyes. What have I done? Harrison whispered. It was the beginning of a long road. Clara May's uncle was publicly exonerated, his name cleared. Harrison Montgomery offered him his job back, with a promotion and a generous settlement that restored his family's security. But more than that, Harrison offered him a quiet, heartfelt apology, man to man. It was an act of humility that reshaped the entire Montgomery legacy. Caleb did not return to Northwood. He chose instead to attend the local public high school, where he graduated with honors a year later. He and his father began to talk. Really talk. They didn't always agree, but they listened. They were not just a CEO and an heir anymore. They were a father and a son, rebuilding a broken bridge, piece by painful piece. One evening, Caleb found Clara May in the garden, reading by the light of the rising moon. My uncle wants to thank you, she said. He said you gave his name back to him. You're the one who did that, Caleb said. You're the one who taught me. Why me, Clara May? Out of everyone, why did you choose me? She closed her book and looked up at him, her startlingly wise blue eyes reflecting the moonlight. My great-grandpa told me something else, she said. He said you can't fix a broken world by fighting the people who broke it. You have to teach their children how to see, because they're the only ones who can convince the kings that their castles are built on sand. Caleb looked out at the sprawling estate, at the perfectly manicured lawns and the glittering lights of the mansion. It was a kingdom built on wealth and power. But he knew now that its greatest treasure was not in the vault or the garage. It was an 11-year-old girl with blonde hair, who knew that the most powerful secret in the world was simply the courage to truly open your eyes. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. Thanks for spending this time with me.